Hello, students. Welcome back to another lecture for History 124 online. This lecture goes together with the required reading, Chapter 6, on Mexican immigration, work, urbanization, and Americanization. Whew, that's a mouthful. I'm titling the lecture, Coming to El Norte. So many Mexicans, nearly 1 million, migrated from Mexico into the U.S. from the period between 1900 and 1930. What was it that either pushed those Mexicans out of their home country or pulled them into the United States? That's part of what we're looking at today. I also want you to think about how would those Mexicans attempt to maintain their culture? And could maintaining their culture mean that they are exercising their agency? If you stand up for your rights, but also stand up for your own humanity, is that a form of resistance to the dominant culture that might be prejudiced against you or discriminating against you? Keep those things in mind as we move forward. So what I want to start with are a couple of key themes. Sorry, it should say themes, not just one theme, but a couple of key themes. And as we look at this image here of these men at a train depot, this would have been a very common image in 1910 in Mexico. Men, in particular, on the move, migrating from one place to another. So, two big things. One, we're going to pay attention to what were the push and pull factors that created Mexican patterns of migration. And we'll go over that in a moment. What does it mean that we have a push factor or a pull factor? Secondly, how did Mexicans maintain their culture when they came to the United States? Because they didn't just get rid of speaking Spanish, having their Catholic religious traditions, having their family values, and things of that nature. So first, I want you to take a few minutes after I pose these questions to write down some answers. I want to introduce you to the terms push and pull factors. So let me define them briefly, and then you're going to pause the video for a few minutes and come up with some of your own ideas. A push factor is something that is so negative, so difficult, that it pushes you out of your homeland. Again, it's something so negative that you can no longer tolerate it and you are being pushed out of the country. On the other hand, a pull factor is something that is so enticing, makes you feel hopeful, gives you the sense that things are going to get better. What might it be that that new country has to offer that would pull you in? So pull factors are associated with positives in one's life. Take a moment, pause the video, and I want you to come up with 3 or 4 push factors and 3 or 4 pull factors. And they don't have to do with just Mexican immigrants. It could be any person moving from one state to another or from one country to another. Even think of your own family histories. Why did your ancestors leave the place they were born, and what pulled them in to the new country that they came to? No, seriously, pause the video, take some notes, then push play. All right. I'm gonna hope that you really did that. So if I were face to face with you, I'd ask you, like, what did you get for push factors? So when I think about my own family's history, my grandparents on both sides of my family came from Mexico. My mom's dad was really pushed out along with his family. He grew up during the time of the Mexican Revolution. So because of warfare and the chaos of that warfare and violence, his family had to flee. They had to pack very quickly and get out of the state of Sonora, and they immigrated into Arizona. So war, violence, that could be a push factor. Another major push factor would be no jobs, the lack of jobs, high unemployment, or such low wages that you're living in poverty. That could also push somebody out of their home country, even though they would want to stay. Pull factors, again, I'm thinking of my own family. When my dad's parents left Mexico, my grandfather was really looking for better economic opportunities. He had lived in a very small town in Jalisco called Outlan. Does anybody know it? Also happens to be the birthplace of Carlos Santana, the famous guitarist. So he left Outlan and went to Mexico City looking for a better job with higher wages. And then once he and my grandmother were married, they decided to go to Los Angeles, where he heard he could get even better jobs with better pay. That pulled him into the United States. Other pull factors might include things like better educational opportunities, a higher standard of living, or perhaps more political freedoms or more civil rights. Another huge pull factor that we also need to remember is family reunification. It's not uncommon in human history for people to send one or two members of their family to immigrate into a new country, and then once those people are settled, the rest of the family is pulled into that country so that the family can reunite. So as we think about reading through chapter 6 and looking at the things that pushed Mexicans out of Mexico and pulled them into the United States, you want to keep that in mind. So, what was Mexico like long ago? If you could imagine that this was your town, your pueblito or village, and this is you right there in that photo. You live in an adobe house that probably your family built with their own hands. You probably work way out there in the campo, and the average pay for a Mexican laborer or farmer in the early 1900s was about 12 cents a day, and you don't see your prospects getting any better. But hearing about this place called El Norte, the United States, where you could make in Texas $1.50 a day in the Texas cotton fields, or you could even make as much as $2 a day doing farm labor in the areas around Los Angeles, that would definitely pull you into a new country. Couple other things I want to say about Mexican migrants and their process of crossing over as we see these campesinos or farmers working in a field in Puebla around 1900. You know, if we go back to the early 20th century, there were millions of immigrants coming into the United States from all over the world, especially Southern and Eastern Europe. For Mexicans, though, one difference is that they were right next to the border. they also had a historical claim to those lands like California, New Mexico, and Texas. So many Mexicans were able to be part of a pattern called circular migration, meaning they would go from Mexico into the United States, work for 6 to 8 months at a time, and then return back to Mexico with the money that they earned, and then a few months later go back again to the United States, earn money, and return to Mexico. That circular migration was something that allowed Mexicans to really hang on to their traditions, to their culture, and not have to give up everything or assimilate into Anglo-American culture, which was so dominant at the time. That seasonal labor would not only be in things like farm work, picking cotton, picking spinach, etc., but also could be in things like construction, mining, railroad work, etc. So, as Mexican migrants are leaving their small towns, moving to larger cities, and then moving to even bigger cities in the United States, that's a process we call urbanization. They go from people of the countryside to being people of the cities. That could lead to a lot of displacement. And as you look at the image there of this woman and two men in the middle of Mexico City in 1910, Mexico City was a vibrant, dynamic metropolis that was very modernized, and these three campesinos really stick out. Their form of dress, with the huaraches that man has on his feet, with the botas or the boots this man has, the woman with her rebozo, makes them seem like, yeah, they're not from the city. So Mexicans were already keeping their traditions alive. Those people who had moved from El Campo, again, that's the countryside, into the city, like let's say going from a tiny town into Guadalajara, into Monterrey, into La Ciudad de Mexico, they're already trying to keep their traditions alive, and that pattern will remain even when they go to the United States. So one thing I like to ask students to do is look at various photographs from this time and really try to imagine what might be going on here. And I wanted you to do that with this photo. It's something I ask students in my face-to-face classes on campus to do all the time. So I know as much about this photo as you do. The caption says "Women Making Tortillas" from 1905, and it comes from USC's Digital Library collection. What do you think is going on here? Who might these people be? Do they all know each other? Are they related to each other? Are they coming? Are they going? Are they here in this moment on a temporary basis or a permanent basis? Think about what story you might give to these people here. And as we look at the photograph more carefully, I hope you're noticing the railroad tracks in the background. I hope you're noticing that these women here have definitely piled up some resources. We've got a pile of wood here. We've got some kind of shelter made from palm fronds, but it doesn't look like it could last a long time. So maybe it's just temporary, but they also can't easily just get up and go because they've got their cooking utensils, their pots and pans. They've got their comal over this stove. So is this a family that's traveling all together, perhaps waiting for the train to take them to El Norte? Or perhaps this man here, maybe he's a stranger to them, but the women have created a small stand where they sell tortillas or they sell tacos, and they're waiting for men who will be traveling to El Norte for work in order to sell them food. The reason I choose this photo to share with students is it gives us a glimpse into life in Mexico in the early 20th century and moving into the 1910, that decade, and into the 1920s, where often women were the ones holding down the fort, so to speak, and men were the ones on the move. Men had to travel, in particular, to find work. We add into this very difficult period then warfare, and that was the Mexican Revolution. Now, that in itself is a fascinating and very complex history, but a few things I want to highlight. Mexico had gone through a period of over 36 years of dictatorship under President Porfirio Diaz. Now, his title, president, is misleading because he stayed in office for 36 years. He was really a dictator. So the revolution in Mexico from 1910 to 1920 is really a civil war in which numerous factions, some led by Pancho Villa, who you see down here sitting on the left, some led by Emiliano Zapata, who you see seated here on the right, were trying to really democratize Mexico and bring about major changes. Here are a few of the major changes they promised. For example, they promised that Mexican campesinos or farmers would get back land in what they called ejidos. An ejido is like a farm, but the whole village or town owned the farm together, they worked the land together, and they shared in the profits together. The Mexican dictator, Porfirio Diaz, had done away with ejidos, and the revolution promised to bring those back. They also promised things like political reform, improved economy, and access to good paying jobs, and they emphasized the idea of universal education to make all Mexicans literate, whether they were male or female. And you see here in this woodcut by the famous artist Jose Guadalupe Posada of the calavera, this skeleton figure that Mexicans have very much as a part of their culture, sort of living side by side with death, sort of laughing in the face of death. And this calavera, this woman, is riding a horse during the time of the revolution. Now, the reality for many women and children during the revolution was brutal. And I share this photo here of a young mother with her children at a refugee camp at the border between Mexico and Arizona. And we see some men in hats here. They would have been the border agents or the people supervising this refugee camp. And this speaks to my own family history. When my maternal grandfather, Guillermo Mimiaga, had to flee out of Sonora, Mexico, with his family, my great-grandfather, Joaquin Mimiaga, told my great-grandmother and his children, look, you go to Los Angeles, use this address, find these people, they will help you get settled. And then when I close up our house, pack up our belongings, I will come and find you. Well, it turns out my grandfather, who was only 6 or 7 years old at the time, never got to see his father again. Until many years later, He'd never even thought about knowing what happened to his dad, except that a man who was from Mexico looked in the phone book on a trip to Los Angeles and found my grandfather, went to his house, knocked on the door, and asked my grandfather, "Was your dad named Joaquin Mimiaga?" And my grandfather said, "Yes." And this man, who only spoke Spanish, said, "That was my father too." Now, the crazy thing is, Mimiaga is an extremely rare name in Mexico. When I went and spent a lot of time in Mexico City in my early 20s, when you look through the phone book of Mexico City, when they used to make phone books, there were only 2 Mimiagas out of the 10 million people in Mexico City. And of course, I was related to both of them. So it turns out my great-grandfather bailed on his first family. Maybe he had a side chick at the same time, but it's more likely that because of the chaos and intensity of the revolution, he just never made it to Los Angeles, ended up staying in Mexico and having a whole other family. Now, on my other side of the family, on my dad's side of the family, this image of what is called, or what was called, a poor house, what we would call an orphanage in Mexico City, is also showing the results of that chaos from the warfare of the Mexican Revolution, where many children were either orphaned or their parents became so poor they were not able to take care of them. That too happened to one of my grandmothers, my dad's mom. She was in a family where her father did not stick around. There were 5 children altogether, and because my grandmother was the youngest and could not yet work, whereas her other siblings who were 12 years old and 14 years old could get jobs, my great-grandmother made the decision to put her youngest daughter, my grandmother, into an orphanage. And she visited her on Sundays once a month when it was possible, but that was the kind of severe poverty many Mexicans experienced. Now, from warfare to intense poverty, what factors would we call that? Push factors. Those are factors that are so bad that they might push people out of their homeland. So, having shared a bit of that personal family history with you all, let's briefly talk about who were those Mexicans who went to El Norte in this time period. The vast majority of them were agricultural workers. They had been campesinos, and they were needing to find wages that they could survive on and hopefully take care of their families with. The majority of people who also immigrated were younger men between the ages of 16 to 26, around that age, because they were able-bodied, ready to work. There definitely were women who also migrated to the United States. However, unless a woman was accompanied by her husband or by a male member of her family, they faced a lot of scrutiny. Women on their own were referred to as solas, single women, and in fact, the immigration officers referred to these women as LPCs, that they were likely to be a public charge, meaning there was an assumption that if a woman didn't have a man to support her, she couldn't work on her own. So she was going to have to go on government welfare. That's where the public charge comes into this. The other assumption about some of these single women is that if they did find a job, it might be a job that was immoral, unethical, thought to be horrible, and that job was prostitution, working as a sex worker. So women face so much scrutiny in trying to cross the border if they were all by themselves. What we do know about this period, though, is this was a mass exodus. Nearly 10% of Mexico's population came to the United States between the period of 1910 to 1925. That is a massive movement of people. Now, we've talked a lot about the push factors. What about the pull? What is it that's pulling these people into the United States? So before I move to the next slide, let me ask you this. Have you ever heard, either directly or heard of, someone say, these Mexicans, they're stealing our jobs? Or Mexican immigrants are taking Americans' jobs? That, in my opinion, but also supported by the historical evidence, is one of the biggest lies that people have been telling for a long time. Mexicans did not steal anyone's job. Rather, United States employers used various strategies to bring quote-unquote greasers into the United States to work for low wages. And I purposely put that term greasers in quotation marks. Greasers, as you might remember from a couple of chapters back, was a term used to identify someone who worked in the hide and tallow industry because they worked with the fat from cows. They came out of work all covered in grease. Well, by the time we get to the late 1800s and early 1900s, greaser is a racist term. It's a derogatory term, a way to put down people of Mexican heritage. So those employers from the United States were specifically recruiting Mexicans to do low-wage work. That is still true today. Some of you, for example, may have learned about the Bracero program that came about during World War II, which was specifically to bring in Mexican laborers to do farm work, while a lot of American men had been drafted to fight overseas. But that practice of specifically going after migrant workers to work in Tyson chicken plants, to work in the slaughterhouses of Iowa, to work in landscaping on Long Island in New York, it is still going on today. The three most important industries that Mexicans were recruited into was number one, agriculture, the most important occupation or industry that Mexicans were pulled into. Can you guess what number 2 and 3 are? Take a minute. I hope you guessed mining is one of them, and railroads. Oh, I said them in the wrong order. So first and most important was agriculture, second were railroads, and third was mining. So this brings up, well, why would Mexicans want to go? Did they know this was low-wage work, at least compared to Anglo-Americans' wages? The thing was, remember, the average campesino in Mexico in the early 1900s made 12 cents a day. Here they were about to earn 10 times that, or even 15 or 20 times that by going in. In addition, American employers used the pull of free travel to get to their new job. They used the pull of saying, in this company town where you're going to be working, let's say like in Ludlow, Colorado, because you're learning about the Ludlow massacre, in this company town, you're going to have everything provided to you. And they were given free travel on the railroads. They were given housing to live in. However, this system of company towns was also very corrupt and exploited this labor. For example, instead of paying miners money at the end of the week for their wages, they paid them in vouchers, or what we call script. And then they could only use that voucher payment at the company store, or to see the company doctor, or to visit the company movie theater. So everything in their lives were run by the company, and many were exploited or ended up in debt if they were to become injured or sick and miss some days of work. One of the most famous company towns that exists close to us was Simon's Brickyard in El Monte, California. Simon's was very proud of having the largest brickyard in the world, he said. And you can see in this image, here are the dwellings, and they're right near where the clay fields were and where the machine housing was. You could also see, though, in this town, there was a school for the workers' children. There was a general store that was owned by the town. There was also things like recreation at the handball court or at the amusement hall. But life in a company town where you're not actually paid with US currency means if you ever want to get out, you will leave with nothing. You'll leave with the clothes on your back. That is it. Because whatever script they paid you with, it's no good anywhere else. So the last thing I want to make sure we look at for a moment is the role of women. How did they survive in this kind of environment? And do their roles help to keep Mexican culture alive? And that is absolutely true. If we look at women in El Norte creating communities, let's say in particular amongst the railroad workers. Railroad workers lived in these so-called boxcar colonias, where they literally took an abandoned boxcar. It was then taken off the rails, and people would convert it into housing that they would live in. However, in the winter, it could be freezing cold. In the summer, horribly hot. And this was substandard housing. In this photo here, we have an image of a woman named Mary Torres, who was a Mexican immigrant, standing outside her home in Chicago. There is snow all the way up to her kneecaps, but she's there showing the entrance to her home. Boxcar colonias still exist even today. In Mexico, the Mexican railway system still functions, although it has a number of issues. But this is a photo of railway workers and their families living in these abandoned boxcars. So within these communities, women kept certain kinds of roles or traditions alive. For example, they would still make sure that every year around Christmas time to set up the tradition of Las Posadas, that is reenacting the travel of Joseph and Mary before she's going to give birth to the baby Jesus. And they would travel from house to house or cottage to cottage in the community they lived in, And at the end of the evening, there would be a party, a gathering. They also would keep traditions from their villages, their pueblitos, of the different fiestas that they had or certain saints' day. In addition, many women practice what we would call comadrasco. So you might have heard of Mexican women having comadres. A comadre is like your best friend, or a woman who is so close to you, she might as well be a sister. And in that comadrasco, there is reciprocity and support between women, of women taking care of each other's children, of helping out a family because maybe the husband was injured or sick and they needed some resources to get by. So all of those things would have been important ways that women kept those traditions alive. In addition, there are some amazing women who helped to fight back against racism. And in a video that I'm going to post in our module, Jovita Idar and the Idar family started a Spanish language newspaper called La Crónica and published stories about the horrors of the Texas Rangers, of the brutality that many Mexicans faced. And in fact, Jovita Idar herself stood up to the Texas Rangers and fought back against that kind of racism. She's an amazing, amazing figure in American history. So as we wrap up, I want you to think about these ideas of culture, changes in ethnicity. When United States religious reformers started Americanization programs, in many ways they wanted to bring immigrants into the fabric of America, but often they wanted to do it by erasing that immigrant's past, erasing their native language, their cultural traditions, and simply making them into Americans. What we see, though, amongst many of these Mexican immigrants is that Mexicans don't yet feel like they're Mexican Americans. They still feel very much tied to their homeland. And in fact, some Mexicans didn't even feel quote unquote Mexican. They felt like they were Jalicenses. They were from Jalisco, or they were from Zacatecas, or they were from Guanajuato. They very much felt connected to the region or state of Mexico that they came from. What we'll see, though, is that permanent Mexican settlement in the United States will lead to these Americanization programs. Some Mexicans will jump on board. They're going to want to learn English right away, take citizenship classes. They're going to want to try to fit in to white American culture as much as possible. And other Mexicans are going to acculturate, meaning they're not going to give up speaking Spanish. They're not going to give up eating the foods that they're accustomed to or practicing their forms of religious rituals, but they will try to integrate Anglo-American ways of life into their own when they think it suits their needs. So, big questions I want to leave you with. Big things I want you to consider are: one, how were Mexicans both pushed out of Mexico and pulled into the United States? And what were some ways that Mexicans held on to their culture? Could that be an example of exercising their agency? What do you think? All right, folks, that's it. I know this was another long one, so I hope you took breaks here and there when you needed to, and I'll see you next time.